It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that makes JRPGs so amazing to me. I had limited experience with them growing up, where all I had was a Sony PlayStation, with access mostly to platforming games like Crash, Spyro, and Mega Man. The best example of a traditional JRPG I had was Digimon World 3, but the game proved too difficult for my tiny child brain at the time, so I got lost in a maze-like desert and was never able to proceed. I had never even heard of Final Fantasy VII until I was in high school, and to this day I find the game impenetrable, despite the fact that I play other games just to have a chance to use Cloud. But there was a single game that opened my eyes many years ago. To this day it stands as one of my favorite games of all time, and though I find it difficult to discern just why that is, I figured that the best way to explain it would be to share it with you. Welcome to Tales, a series of action Japanese role-playing games that draw some slight parallels to Final Fantasy, namely that most of the games have isolated stories and worlds from one another. We've also got swords, magic, and ancient technologically advanced civilizations. If you're familiar with other works of high fantasy, then you'll feel right at home, but you'll probably have to adjust to the tsundere girls walking around. Today we're taking a look specifically at Tales of Vesperia, one of the mothership titles in the franchise. Vesperia has no definite connections to any other game in the series, and it was the first Tales game I ever played, so I can assure you that no prior knowledge is necessary to enjoy it, but it definitely helps considering all of the cameos and references. Vesperia originally released as an Xbox 360 game in 2008. It was enhanced a year later on the PS3 to include a bunch of new content as well as some cosmetic DLC. That version of the game didn't see a release in the US and could only be played by those that either knew Japanese or utilized translation materials. One such translation was created by the Tales of Vesperia translation team, which didn't become available until 2015. The most recent version of the game to see a release is the Definitive Edition, released for various consoles and PC in January 2019, which is a remastered version of the PS3 port, now available in English. As well as the Definitive Edition, I played both the original Xbox release of Vesperia almost a decade ago, as well as the PS3 port in 2016, both to 100% completion, which took somewhere around 200 hours for the latter. The reason that knowledge is important is so that you know I'm not messing around when I say I like Vesperia. Although Tales is regarded as one of the more well-known JRPG franchises, sales have never been especially strong for the series, with only a few titles ever reporting over 1 million sales, Vesperia not being one of them. Broadly speaking, I think that Vesperia has many different aspects that are common in JRPGs, like overworlds, dungeons, airships, towns, shops, equipment, and more. But it's bolstered to new heights thanks to the outstanding cast of characters being one of the best I've gotten to know in a game. Additionally, it has a massive amount of collectibles and content that both satisfy the completionist in me as much as they infuriate it. I really do enjoy spending tens of hours looking for monsters to scan for my compendium, or crafting all the different items I've yet to see, even if it is insane. However, as I was making note of with my most recent playthrough, Vesperia is far from perfect. It has a lot of quirks and flaws, and the Definitive Edition even more so than the originals, which is a huge shame. A lot of things can be attributed to age, but unfortunately that excuse only goes so far and simply doesn't apply to the DE. If you're pedantic enough, you can spot inconsistencies with the storytelling and start picking things apart very early in the game, which I myself will do later on just to give you some examples. Even still, you're likely to be the kind of person who doesn't want to spend a lot of time doing some of the absurd content the game has on offer. There's just too many games to play nowadays, and it takes way too long. I liken it to the original Zelda, where that game had obscure and frustrating puzzles which could be enjoyed or despised depending on your perspective. The games themselves are apples to oranges, but I think the same principle applies to Vesperia's content, though luckily not with any mandatory objectives. If you're just getting to this game in 2019, you're going to have to compromise with it in order to enjoy it, because it's just not 2008 anymore. I mean, obviously. You're going to have some graphical and mechanical issues to get over, and it might be grating for you depending on your tolerance to things like that. If you've played any newer Tales games, then this is absolutely going to be a step backwards in most cases, but I'll save the talk about mechanics for later, so we'll start with the graphics. I'm playing the game on PC, which generally runs more smoothly than both the 360 and PS3 releases. The game crashed only once throughout all of my playtime, and I'd be willing to bet it was user error. The only other negatives I came across for the PC release are a micro stutter when moving around and a noticeable freeze when crossing certain invisible lines in towns. The micro stutter was something that I initially didn't really notice, but the entire game felt off in a way that I can only retroactively conclude to be caused by lost frames. In certain areas like the Crystal Lands, the issue is much more clear. There's reportedly a fix for this from Chaldean, a reputable modder, but I didn't use it when playing the game for this video so that my results would be accurate to the vanilla product. As for the invisible lines thing, I believe it's a trigger for larger towns to spawn NPCs in other areas when you get close. I imagine that when you hit these triggers, all of the NPCs spawn at once, causing a tiny bit of lag. It's not really a big issue, but it's definitely noticeable if you go to Zophius enough times and climb the ramp to the public area. Otherwise, the game looks and performs like it always has, but with a clearer image and less loading overall. Vesperia's cel-shaded look helps preserve its original appearance, similar to something like Wind Waker, but far less embellished and cartoony. I think the graphics are all well and good, and I don't have any real issues with them, but I can't say the same for the animations. Vesperia was definitely a step up from Tales of the Abyss, but it's totally blown out of the water by the likes of even Tales of Graces on the Wii, which came out just a year later on inferior hardware. Characters in Vesperia are extremely stiff outside of combat and have a habit of looking like these jointed action figures, moving bit by bit between lines of dialogue. I remember showing the original game to one of my friends a decade ago, and even back then he couldn't stop laughing when he would just let a scene hang on a bit of dialogue. Spells are sometimes cast during cutscenes, and the effect they have on people goes from 0 to 60 with nobody reacting until they get hit, and then having everything happen at once. It's a shame because it's almost a complete 180 when you're in a fight. You have an array of basic combat options like attacking and blocking, as well as a variety of spells and special attacks. For melee characters, these flow relatively seamlessly from one to the other, with the most egregious issue I can think of being that your animations take too long to end, so you're forced to do animation cancels to get out. Spellcasters aren't quite as lucky because they perform the same animations over and over with no real flow between them. If I had to guess, it's probably because they aren't really meant to link spells to one another outside of certain special mechanics, whereas it's straight up part of a melee character's combo game. Still, it's hardly an excuse. Then there are the special attacks like burst arts and mystic arts, which look flashy and cool, but they specifically require the game to halt your character and set their animation in order to do a long scripted attack. This issue was significantly worse on the 360 and PS3, where the game would freeze for 2 or 3 times longer than it does on the definitive edition. Again, I don't think a lot of these are big enough issues to be overly concerned about, but it all comes down to your personal tolerance. I think it's easy to look past what minor issues there are in combat, but the cutscenes outside of battle are the main way the story is driven forward, and you'll end up watching at least a dozen hours worth of them by the end. If you plan on making it all the way through, then get used to seeing stiff movement, characters turning away from people they're talking to for no reason, and for mouths to flap totally out of sync.
Yeah, I guess you're not too sexy anyway.
I'm sexy enough, thank you very much.
Anyways, that's enough big, sweeping accusations. It's time to get down to the nitty-gritty. I probably haven't made much of a positive impression on you so far, but if you have any interest in playing the game for yourself, then be aware that this is a spoiler warning. I'm going to be talking about details of the game from here on out, including story moments. If it's any consolation, I think that the game is definitely worth playing if you're a fan of JRPGs, but seriously take my advice to heart in tempering your expectations with how the game looks and feels. Once we begin the game, we're quickly introduced to our main character, Yuri Lowell, and his dog, Rapide. Take special note of Yuri because as the main and best character, I'm going to be talking about him a lot. They live in a world infested with monsters of all kinds, where humans are forced to hide behind magic barriers that protect their cities. The barriers are powered by Blastia, and the Blastia are powered by air, spelled with an E instead of an I. If that was confusing, then don't worry, it should be. All of this information is dumped into your lap before you even gain control for the first time, but they're talked about so much throughout the game that you're bound to understand at least the basic principles of the concept eventually. Someone steals the core of the Fountain Blastia where Yuri lives, prompting him to try and retrieve it from the thief so the residents have a safe water source. This starts the game off with a fairly insignificant task for us: go get the special battery. But it quickly grows in scope with each new discovery by the party, making the process of obtaining each new objective feel relatively organic. It's on repeat playthroughs of the game that I've come to really appreciate how modestly the story begins, even if I think that overall it's fairly weak during this first portion. For quite a while into the first act, you're bogged down by wave after wave of cutscenes and exposition setting up the world. Again, it's pretty standard fare for a game like this, and the amount of cutscenes and dialogue never really goes down, but you're eventually given more freedom with how to spend your time in the world, with more places to explore and things to do, so there's more to break up the pace. New to the updated version of the game at least are skippable cutscenes, which save a lot of time in the event you don't care about what's going on or you had to reload a save. Another reason for the game's slow intro is because of the combat. When you start the game, you only have control of Yuri, who can do a few basic attacks and only has access to Azure Edge. You likely won't learn any new arts by the time you fight Zagi, the first boss, so every single battle is the exact same. If you set the game on hard for whatever reason, you won't earn anything extra for your effort, and instead, fights will just take longer and be more taxing on your limited resources. This obviously changes down the road, but it takes a long time to get there. Yuri's the most obvious choice for the player to focus on mastering when they play for the first time, and all he learns for the first 4 to 6 hours of the game are different base arts, which really don't alter the way you play in any way, since Yuri's attacks are sparsely elemental. Once your party starts expanding, you can switch who you play as so long as you're not already in battle, but everyone either has the same issue as Yuri with an underdeveloped kit, or they just aren't as effective at fighting like Estelle. Really, the only choice you have is to just bear with it for hours and hours on end. Your first real improvement to combat will come in the form of Overlimit, which is similarly a one-trick pony ability when you first unlock it. The only thing that's really likely to keep you invested throughout all these hours is probably Yuri, who you might recall I told you to pay attention to like 2 minutes ago. Yuri himself is nobody special in the world of Vesperia. From the start of the game to the end, he won't have ever gained a substantial reason for pressing on other than because he's just doing what he wants to do, because it's what he thinks is best to do. He's just a normal guy who does crazy-ass flips with his weapons and punches giant monsters in the face. These traits make him both immediately interesting and relatable. He's heroic as much as he is sarcastic, the culmination of which leads to far more real of a person than I've generally come to expect in a video game. He learns a few minor lessons here and there, but even his application of those lessons is far from ideal, and he makes plenty of decisions that could be considered poor. He isn't the chosen one, and he doesn't have some sort of secret power. He's a lowly commoner with resolve. I think that's the kind of underdog tale that a lot of us can really agree with. It's easy to align yourself with Yuri for most of the adventure, and it doesn't feel as forced as template characters or protagonists whose only negatives are that they're too perfect. Yuri also has anti-hero qualities that really start to set him apart from traditional JRPG protagonists, and more cool quotes than I'll ever have. If you don't like Yuri, then I think you'll have a hard time enjoying the game, I can say that much. After we get a few dungeons under our belt, we get our first party members: Estelle, Carol, and Rita. Rapid's there too, but he's a dog, so. Each of them starts off as fairly typical and annoying anime tropes, which you might be surprised to hear that I don't enjoy. But, like most things in Vesperia, they'll get significantly better over time. Estelle is the dedicated healer and sheltered princess, which is supposed to be kind of a secret for a while, but they don't really make any effort to hide it. In fact, it's probably harder to assume that she isn't a princess. She's probably the closest to a chosen one this game will come to have, being directly involved in the catastrophe of the third and final act of the game. She'll also immediately heal anyone on site that's been injured, which, if you've played the game, you know is a very big no-no. This is alluded to by Yuri and Rita when they grab her hand after being healed by her for the first time, which is a nice bit of foreshadowing. Estelle's start as a character who's never left the castle and only has knowledge of the outside world through books is sort of tired. In fact, it's remarkably close to Luke from Tales of the Abyss, except Luke's reasoning and attitude were significantly more interesting, and built upon within the plot in ways that I won't spoil for you. Here, Estelle is a sheltered noble because she can be. There really is no greater justification for it, and besides from some comedic moments like her gag with learning high fives, it seems to just give her an excuse to read excerpts from books, which to me has always felt like a clumsy way to inform the player about things. It's not abrasively annoying by any means, it's just a lazy outline for a character in my opinion. The way she exemplifies traits in other characters by extension of her friendship with them is really what define her for me. For instance, there's a great scene early in the game when Yuri and Estelle first meet. Estelle is cornered by a group of knights and Yuri decides to save her. The sight of Yuri's attack makes Estelle believe that Flynn has come to rescue her. Now, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I believe this is a nod to Demon Fang, an attack usually used by the main characters of Tales games. Demon Fang is a ground-based shockwave that in earlier games was suggested to be usable only by a true hero. Flynn, a paragon of justice, uses this attack in the game, but Yuri's version of it is different. This simple distinction, that Yuri may not be a hero because he doesn't use Demon Fang, is subtle, and possibly not even intentional. But I love it. It's further highlighted when Estelle turns to face him, only to see Yuri standing there with his dark appearance and a sword in his hand. She even tries to smash a vase over his head because she thinks he looks dangerous. Of course, in the end, this scene really doesn't do a lot for Estelle. It serves as another interesting insight of Yuri's character, but that's mostly the point. Estelle's personal arc mostly involves her leaving home and seeing the world. She has a subplot involving imperial succession, but it doesn't really manifest itself in any meaningful ways. The most important facet of her character, that she's a child of the full moon, relates back to the plot as a whole. Her related development really just involves her becoming more of a reasonable human being instead of an exaggerated cartoon character who can't think for herself. So yeah, I guess you could say I don't have an amazing opinion of Estelle. I still like her in the end, but I think that's against the odds, so to speak. I also think she's a necessary component of the game, by which I mean a lot of the story elements seem to tie back to her existence, but she's so steeped in tropes that I find it hard to take her character seriously sometimes. It's a similar story for Rita, but I like Rita's design and interactions with everyone a lot more.
I'm just used to using magic, and I've been working to cultivate a calm mind.
A calm mind, huh?
Is there something wrong with that?
Ooh! Ouch! Sorry, I thought you were a monster.
I'll startle you someday. You just wait.
By the time the party catches up with Flynn, each character's reasoning for continuing will begin to fluctuate between stops, and everyone will frequently splinter off the main group later on, lending an air of believability to the party dynamic, but most of them are never gone for long. Even in the case of someone like Judith, who has a scare that she might be gone for good, eventually returns. And that brings up an interesting point. It's tough to think about what the ideal solution is when it comes to characters in an RPG dying or betraying you. Spoilers for Final Fantasy VII, but when Aerith is killed and removed from the party for good, was it more of a net positive because of the narrative, or a net negative because of the reduction of characters and options you have? There's no right answer here, but we can try and imagine what Vesperia would be like without Judith. Suddenly, for the majority of content in the game, it wouldn't be possible to have a spear user, or an aerial character. You could never see what it's like to bring her against the final boss or the Spiral Draco, or see what sort of potential she could have had. And yet, it would have spoke volumes about the party if they were forced to punish her for betraying them. It could have completely altered the course of events in the game, having Yuri jumped off the slippery slope of taking matters into his own hands. We can actually see a minor example of this in Flynn, who didn't actually travel with the party in the original release, but now has had the story slightly altered just to include him. It's not a great example since it was retroactive and a minor change to the plot overall, but you can see the implication that just one character could bring. Speaking of Flynn, the entire reason for Estelle joining up with Yuri at the start of the game is so that she can be escorted to Flynn and warn him of some sort of danger. When the two finally catch up, nothing ever comes of it. Maybe this is just an issue of the story being from Yuri's point of view, but it comes off as a loose end. In fact, there's a scene a little earlier after we see Yuri's excellent wanted poster, in which Flynn actually knows about assassins chasing after Yuri, which makes it even less believable that he wouldn't be aware of something posing as a threat to him. It's all very shaky and gets me thinking that a better excuse for Estelle needing to leave the castle could have been thought up. In the end, it doesn't really compromise the story as a whole, but it serves as one of a few examples of missing or fabricated details. As you could probably tell from his outfit, Flynn is a knight, but he's also a childhood friend of Yuri's. Despite being on the cover of the original game, Flynn only ever joined the party for a single battle during the story, which came as a major surprise to me when I first finished the game. I was absolutely certain that Flynn would eventually drop what he was doing to come help out the gang, but it never came to be, which is arguably something the game should have made more clear. Luckily, Namco Bandai realized their mistake quickly enough and added Flynn to the roster in the port of the game, though he certainly takes his time to do so. As a knight, Flynn is tasked with upholding the law, and it's a job that he takes very seriously. Up to this point, Yuri has already committed a few crimes, including the kidnapping of Princess Estelle, jailbreak, assault on the knights, and obstruction of justice. Even though each of these was a necessary component for Yuri and his adventure, they're still crimes in the eyes of the law, and Flynn finds himself in the unenviable position of having to hold his friend accountable. Even when I saw Flynn for the first time all those years ago, he was immediately one of the more interesting characters, both because of his steadfast ideals and his foil to Yuri. The fact that the two have history also lent Flynn a bit of extra intrigue compared to the others, especially when you consider the strange relationship the two seem to have, jumping back and forth between each other's sides. This is the beginning of what I think is among the most interesting plot threads in the entire game: Yuri and Flynn's relationship and their views on justice. Our first taste of it comes when the party infiltrates the mansion of the corrupt magistrate Rigaud, where they learn that he's essentially forced people to hunt a dangerous and deadly monster to pay his overwhelming taxes. If they refuse, he kidnaps members of their family, including children, and dumps them into a lair of monsters in his basement to be killed.
Hobbies? Oh, you must mean my basement. Only someone with my refined sensibilities could understand the pleasure I derive from such things.
Though Rigaud is eventually caught, he feigns ignorance and manages to avoid repercussion for his actions. This happens again later when Rigaud is caught in the midst of treason, only to reduce charges against himself using his political position.
It looks like he's gonna get off with only a minor drop in rank after everything he did!
Flynn makes his stance known. Though him and Yuri both seek to do what is right and just, Flynn seeks to do so from within, by changing the law so that future criminals like Rigaud are properly punished. However, Yuri's rage has already been ignited. If fixing the law down the line means the possibility of letting others get hurt in the meantime, then Yuri can't abide by it. And so Yuri takes matters into his own hands and punishes Rigaud by killing him. This is only the first murder that Yuri commits in the name of justice, but he vows to burden himself with whatever he has to in order to do what he thinks is right, including staining his hands with blood. I can't even begin to explain how interesting and compelling this subplot is, and it's made even better by the fact that the game never actually takes a side. Back and forth, Yuri and Flynn butt heads and bicker throughout the entire game despite their friendship, and yet both of them are right. Both of them are wrong. Is it right to release someone knowing the likelihood of them committing another offense? Should you punish someone before they've offended if you're absolutely sure that they will? You might be in Yuri's shoes throughout the game, but at times it's hard not to feel like maybe you've taken the wrong side. Yuri even threatens Flynn's life at one point.
What is he?
If you go and become a villain, you won't be giving me much choice.
Yuri?
Seriously, I can't praise this element of the story enough. Besides Yuri, there's another character in the game that I think gets a significant amount of development, and that's Carol. When I first played through Vesperia, I had all eyes on Yuri, and I really disliked Carol, who I saw as a little kid with an annoying voice. He still is both of those things to an extent, but after playing a couple more times, I've realized that he really comes a long way throughout the story. He may start off as a little kid boasting about this and that, but after he gets defamed by the very person that he might care about the most, I start to feel a little sorry for him. To have someone so harshly criticize you in front of your new friends? I mean, I can hardly imagine something more embarrassing than that. He's been kicked out of every guild he's ever joined and just now been removed from the hunting blades. Now his diverse skill set is revealed to be more than just a contrivance for the plot to move forward, like him being able to pick locks on doors and drawing maps. It has implications of his past experience in a variety of guilds, never being able to find a place that he belongs. That insight into Carol's character is important and humanizing. All that time before, he had been a one-note brat, talking big and never following through. And yet, despite that, he doesn't give up. He gets picked on by everyone, including his own party members. But when it gets real and people take it beyond friendly teasing, that's when Yuri and the gang step up and defend him, which in turn helps him grow. Their support in Carol gives him the confidence to start a guild with them, and it not only works out, but Carol gets to be the leader. In Act 2, Carol's hero, the Dawn, is forced to take his own life to atone for the mistakes of his grandson, and Carol starts to lose hope. If his own role model, as strong as he was, had to die, then what hope would Carol have? Especially without the Dawn's guidance anymore.
You can always do everything you want, Yuri! You'd never understand how I feel! I'm not tough like you! There's no way I can be like you and the Dawn! It's over! Our guild is...
Carol! Don't you remember all the Dawn told you? Did you forget his resolve? As a member of our guild, I'm going to Mount Timsa to find Judy.
Huh?
Brave Vesperia will go on. Even if you don't. This guild is more than just you now.
Carol just breaks down and cries. This scene is powerful to me. I like it even more than when Carol saves everyone from the Baitajo later on. It shows him letting down his facade for once and being really vulnerable. I mean, how often do you see a kid like Carol open up like that? Afterwards, he catches up at the party and expresses humility, hoping to work his way up to greatness. Really, I find it difficult to think of another instance in the game where anyone has more significant character development than that. He even has a side quest later where he trains using the Dawn's sword, and it lets Carol learn his mystic art, which is a strong bit of narrative tied to game elements. The majority of the first act revolves around setting up the cast and introducing important plot elements. By the end of it, we'll have gotten a chance to play with everyone but Patty, and we'll have visited a large number of locations. The final boss of the act is Barbos, the man responsible for the theft of the core that Yuri has been looking for. The events so far have been okay, but are by far the most boring of the game. Aside from maybe Flynn, nobody's really accomplished anything significant. With Barbos gone, Rigaud's treason is revealed, which as you recall we already went over. However, I should mention that the game presents another solid moment of gameplay and narrative tying together, as Yuri and Rapide both receive titles for the murder, but no fanfare is played as in all other instances of the game. A subtle way of saying that this isn't a celebration. Yuri has committed a great sin. Once we get into the overworld, you'll immediately notice a compelling change. The tone of the game has been shifted by changing the overworld theme as well as the battle theme. It's a bit of detail that goes a long way in my opinion. Act 1 feels like the start of a journey, whereas Act 2 feels like the tension is rising. Changing the music not only alleviates the repetition of hearing the same tracks over and over, but it helps you invest yourself in the overarching narrative at play. Things would likely return to normal for Yuri and company, but a giant monster who can speak calls Estelle an insipid poison and tries to kill her. Everyone will continue to refer back to this moment with the exact words, insipid poison, which has always rubbed me the wrong way. I mean, wouldn't you just start saying poison eventually? Anyways, it's at this point that Carol, Yuri, and Judith form a guild. Estelle names the guild Brave Vesperia after the brightest star in the night sky. This is what we like to call an I get it moment. The focus of the journey then shifts to finding the giant monster from earlier, Pharaoh. Along the way, the brand new character from the port, Patty, finally joins up for the first time, if only temporarily. She's a little pirate girl with a high voice that has a thing for Yuri, and she's constantly on the look for both treasure and her memories. Yes, cliché, I know. Patty is shunned and looked down upon for her relation to the legendary pirate Eifried, who is said to have slaughtered dozens of innocent people. To some it might be obvious, but to those of you who don't know, and remember, you did comply with the spoiler, it's later revealed that Patty actually is Eifried, and her age has been reduced by magical means, though she never committed any sort of massacre. It isn't until the very end of the game that you actually learn this, and it just takes a long time for Patty's story to really flesh itself out. Maybe it's because I played the Xbox version of Vesperia first, or maybe it's because Patty had to be written in after the fact, but I don't think her character really meshes very well with the rest of the party. In a lot of scenes, she simply has a line of dialogue inserted that isn't directed at anybody and is just there for her to say something. Plenty of story moments and skits don't even do that, and she just remains on the sidelines, silent, adding nothing. Don't get me wrong, Patty has her moments, and she can be just as funny as everyone else, but it's almost too apparent that she was an afterthought of sorts. Her fighting style, although I haven't personally invested a lot of time with it, is a good extension of her personality at least. It revolves around switching styles to alter attacks that generally have random outcomes, as well as silly props like a rocket ship blasting her off screen, only to come crashing down later with varying results.
The Queen of the Seas has arrived!
I suppose that means it's about time to talk about combat as a whole. I already mentioned this briefly, but at the start of Vesperia, you only have control of Yuri, and even though you can eventually switch to other characters, I imagine most people will just stick with him for the playthrough. He's also the character that you'll have access to 99% of the time, so I'll mostly be talking about combat from his perspective. Tales is first and foremost an action game. That much is probably obvious from what footage you've seen so far. There are no random encounters, and you can give yourself only the slightest of advantages by stunning enemies for a few seconds using the Sorcerer's Ring, which isn't consistent in the first place. Not as good as Paper Mario. Unlike Paper Mario, however, you can set up a party formation and AI tactics, but this will mostly be done before you start a battle. Once you're in the thick of it, you'll have access to the following: basic attacks, arts and spells, running and free running, blocking, overlimit, and your menus. When moving around on the battlefield, your character is affixed to an invisible 2D plane like a fighting game. You can move straight towards or straight away from your targeted opponent, or otherwise hold the free run button. You can jump too, but when we do that as Yuri, it's usually an accident. When holding the free run button, your tether is broken and you're able to move in all 360 degrees of space on the battlefield with no restraint. Once you're comfortable with your positioning, you can start attacking. This differs depending on what character you decide to control, but in Yuri's case, he can perform a string of basic attacks with directional modifiers, and then one base art, and then one arcane art, which are just fancy names for the different tiers of attacks. You can think of this as sort of a chain of available actions. When following the action chain without any weapon skills, you can only go up. If you decide to go up the chain before finishing with an earlier step, then you need to stop moving for a second or block to reset your available pool of actions. The game forces this upon you with absurd end lag on most of your moves, but you can animation cancel by free running, though you'll still need to do a reset. An example of the early game chain would be basic attack, basic attack, basic attack, base art, arcane art, which is the maximum default combo. Or you can simply do an arcane art with nothing else before it, but you won't be able to take any further actions in either example until you reset. The only ways around these restrictions are to either equip appropriate weapon skills to your character, or to activate overlimit. Weapon skills are the main way your characters will get stronger aside from leveling, giving various abilities ranging from generic stat increases to longer basic combos to allowing Rita to levitate. Overlimit is a little more complicated to explain. You build up this gauge here whenever your party members take or receive damage, and you can consume up to 4 levels of the gauge to not only clear the space around you, but to gain powerful buffs based on the level you reached. At the maximum power of Overlimit 4, a character can attack and use arts with no restriction to their action chain, cast instantly, perform burst and mystic arts, consume no TP, and become immune to damage and staggering. This is incredibly powerful, and one of your most potent tools. Unfortunately, you only get overlimits 1 and 2 through the story, and you're forced to get the other increments on your own. Additionally, bosses are able to use overlimit as well, but their versions are different. And when it comes to combat, things don't even end there. There are also Fatal Strikes. Fatal Strikes allow us to kill regular enemies in one hit, regardless of their remaining HP or the amount of damage the actual attack itself did. When it comes to bosses, it's simply a high damage attack. In order to perform a Fatal Strike, we have to deplete a special gauge on an enemy by attacking it, leaving them temporarily susceptible. However, there are actually 3 separate gauges for Fatal Strike, each having a corresponding color and direction. Specific enemy types have vulnerabilities and resistances to the different colors, and give bonuses depending on the one used. Every art has a specific color and direction tied to it, and your basic attacks are tied to the direction of the arrow. The general rule of thumb I find is that each attack and art you have has a specific sort of momentum attached to it. Azure Edge, for instance, is a projectile and therefore has a lot of forward momentum. Unfortunately, plenty of attacks are either ambiguous or just don't follow that rule, so it's best to just memorize what arts you frequently use. And that's the basics of combat. Unfortunately, the game never really asks too much of you when it comes to combat. Even on harder difficulties, you can simply power up your character's stats so high that it won't even really matter, so it's mostly on you to experiment with all of the available systems. The way most people end up utilizing Overlimit, for instance, is to either spam their basic attack or their arts over and over. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be honest. The game doesn't bother to teach you anything after you learn how to do burst arts in Act 1, so if you enjoy the game without digging any deeper, then there's no harm done. But for those seeking a significant level of complexity, it's something that's on them to do. Here's another unfair game comparison. Consider Devil May Cry, where there is a challenge and you can earn certain rankings, but it's only there if you want it. You can go through a lot of the game just using the absolute most basic combos that you want, but if you want to be stylish, well, that's up to you. You can just use Azure Edge over and over throughout the whole game, and it will get stronger for you having done so. Or you could spread that power evenly across a variety of arts and make the game more entertaining for yourself. I'm not much of an intrinsic player, so I tend to just take the path of least resistance. If you want an example of someone who can take the combat system to its very limits, then I absolutely recommend that you check out the YouTube user Omega Evolution. He has tons of Vesperia content, and unlike me, he's actually good at the game. The last thing that I want to mention, and I promise it is the last thing before we move on with the story, is Mystic Arts. These are your character's ultimate attacks, or limit breaks if you prefer, and can only be used under specific circumstances. When you activate one, all of the action halts and your character drops to the ground in order to begin a set animation. Going out of your way to perform these attacks on their own usually isn't worth it aside from the spectacle, but they make for excellent combo enders, which is evident from the activation process. In the updated version of the game, each party member was given access to one additional Mystic Art, which all featured animated cut-ins so that you knew they were extra special. Yuri and Flynn get a third Mystic Art that's performed jointly, and it's easily one of the flashiest and most powerful attacks in the entire game. These Mystic Arts are seriously the pinnacle of cool to me. It's kind of like taking each character's personality and just boiling it down into one big cutscene attack, and it never really gets old for me no matter how many times I see them. Yuri attacks his enemies with repeated slashes from the shadows. Rita performs a long incantation before announcing it as the fruit of her research.
This is the fruit of my research.
And Rapide doesn't initially have a name for his because he's a dog who can't talk. Seriously, there's just enough thought behind most of these attacks that I could probably gush about them for much longer, and later on I probably will. Later Tales games opted for more Mystic Arts that were generally shorter animations, and I struggle to determine which method I like more. Still, I view Vesperia's Mystic Arts as the gold standard for limit break attacks in other games. After quite a lot of trekking, the party finally encounters Pharaoh, who's been hyped up to be a boss ever since we saw him, though that unfortunately never comes to pass, so it's kind of a big tease. Estelle learns that her power is slowly killing the planet, which throws her for a loop and soon results in her being kidnapped. Oh no, a damsel in distress, another overused trope. I say that, but I'm just being glib. The pace of the game at this point speeds up considerably, and I honestly think that this is the best stretch of the game in its entirety. Up to this point, we've gone through many dungeons, including some that felt like they were just included to pad out playtime, including the most recent one, Igathor Forest. However, as soon as Estelle is kidnapped, there's a strong motivation to get her back by pressing on to the next dungeon immediately. She's not only an important character in the plot, but she's also the person you've been with the longest aside from Yuri, and is likely pivotal in your combat strategy as the main healer. With Raven gone as well, this feeling is intensified even further, as your team is now quite noticeably fractured. At worst, half of your main lineup might have just disappeared in a single moment. For me, the events of the plot continue to be this compelling for the next 3 or so dungeons, and really remind me about why I play JRPGs in the first place. To feel so connected and so involved in the events of these imaginary cartoon people that I'd forgo going to work or school just to see what happens next. As I just mentioned, Raven is also gone, though if you're astute, you might have picked up on the fact that I didn't say he was kidnapped. Our resident old man in Letcher turns out to be a double agent with an alter ego, Knight Captain Schwan. He was the one who kidnapped Estelle and is now attempting to kill the party under orders from the Commandant of the Knights, Alexei.
Sorry, I'm not gonna go easy just because you're old.
I would be honored to fight with everything I have.
Still though, it's 1 versus 4, and Schwan uses many of the same tricks that he used when he was tagging along with you, so it's no surprise he wouldn't stand a chance.
What is that?
I would have thought such a blow would be the end of me. of this cursed body.
After being defeated, Schwann makes a final sacrifice to atone for his betrayal, allowing the party to escape, but at the cost of his own life.
Must be getting soft in my old age.
Nah, I'm just kidding. Just as soon as you start to really think that your friend turned traitor turned friend again Raven is gone for good, he reappears at the start of the next dungeon, pronouncing his alter ego Schwann dead for good. Despite kidnapping Estelle and almost killing everyone, the only thing anyone wants in return to become amicable again is to just give Raven a quick smack on the head. While we're on the topic of Raven, I wanted to mention a couple more things. His story's fairly complicated, so I won't spend too much time on it, but he's definitely one of the most memorable characters, so I figure it's worth the diversion. You see, his antics throughout the game, constantly making you second-guess his allegiances, and the big reveal that he's been working directly under Alexei, who's also a traitor, and that Raven considers himself dead because his heart's been replaced by a Blastia. It's all a lot to take in at first, so it feels like a bit of an ass pull. That said, I think it ends up being satisfying overall. It's definitely not all handled in the best way, as Schwann isn't really someone you're likely to give a shit about, and Raven's so tricky by design that it's almost obvious that if anyone were to betray you, it'd be him. But the culmination of Raven constantly making mutterings about being a dead man, and his allowing of Yuri to strike a fatal blow on him, speaks a lot to the mindset of his character. The kind of person who doesn't want to follow orders, or to even live because he thinks the life given to him was wasted, among other things. Can you imagine that? Being kept alive by some machine? Or being wholly indebted to someone for saving your life, despite never asking for it? I mean, that's some pretty heavy stuff. At the risk of sounding like a broken record at this point, I find it really compelling, and that's to say nothing of his backstory about a fallen love. Raven's mystic art, and by extension Captain Schwann's, is a burst of energy called Blast Heart that erupts from his, Blastia heart. After he uses this move in either persona, he clutches his chest for a moment because of the immense strain. While it definitely makes it one of the less effective mystic arts, it's nice to see yet another example of gameplay and story integration. Not every move has to be powerful to be interesting. In the boss fight against him, you can actually take advantage of his exhaustion for some sweet gamer points. Are you starting to see why I find it so easy to like the cast? Almost everything a character does in and out of battle says something about the kind of person they are, but I digress. By the end of the game, Raven is on good terms with everyone, and is actually looking forward to the future rather than moping about being a dead man. Having him come back around is definitely something I appreciate, as Raven is undoubtedly one of the funnier cast members, and I wouldn't want to have him replaced or left behind. I'll always remember his somber story for how concise and impactful it is. However, Raven presents his own issue with the story much like Estelle did earlier, and it's soon called into question after his return to the party. For those unaware, the reasoning behind Raven, or rather Schwann's betrayal, is stated to be that Alexei had fixed him with his new heart, bringing him back to life or staying his death, whichever you prefer. It's then implied, if not outright stated, that Alexei controls his life through some means like a remote shutoff. Definitely more than just a moral debt that Raven felt the need to repay. However, when the party actually confronts Alexei, he makes no mention of it and then does nothing to stop Raven from helping the others defeat him. I really can't understand this issue at all. With the Estelle thing earlier, delivering her message to Flynn, I could at least think of one good excuse for the game not addressing it. But with this, I just don't see one. The best I can do is wildly speculate about details that aren't even in the game, but that would obviously get me nowhere. Raven's Heart Blastia will be the subject of another issue down the line, but I don't think it's as significant as this one. Really, if anyone has a solid answer to this, let me know. Raven rejoins the party aboard the Heracles, a giant walking mech tank thing, to continue the journey to save Estelle from Alexei. Unfortunately, the dungeon is a total detour, as Estelle isn't actually there, and the only important thing that happens aboard the Heracles is a misfiring of its main cannon that causes headaches for everyone later. The Heracles is really worth mentioning for the fact that it's probably one of the most technical and interesting dungeons in terms of design in the entire game, at least from my perspective. Most dungeons boil down to basically just shooting whatever you can with the Sorcerer's Ring while advancing along a single path. Sometimes you have branching paths, but they're nearly always guaranteed to be a short detour to a dead end with a chest. It's honestly really disheartening that most of the dungeons in Vesperia have really nothing going on, and therefore nothing to say about them. The only exemptions to this are probably the Oath Waterway and the extra dungeons. Unfortunately, the Oath Waterway is just dark, and that's about all there is to say about that one. Even in something as simple as Pokemon, you have puzzles like pushing rocks in the holes or sliding on ice tiles. They're not the most advanced puzzles, but they're certainly more engaging than what Vesperia has on offer most of the time. The Heracles then, at least, has a semi-complicated layout and a puzzle that takes place over 2 rooms, if only barely. There are mechanics in Vesperia for pushing blocks around, but they're not actually used in the main dungeons, and I just can't understand why that is. They're taught to you at the very beginning of the game before you go into the Zophius sewers, but then they're only ever used here in the Heracles and then in an optional side quest. They have the ingredients for puzzles and they just don't use them. It's so frustrating. You can't even get lost in these dungeons for the most part. And that's saying something, considering there are no maps in dungeons aside from Bactian and maybe the Necropolis. With all of that said, you might think that I actually like the Heracles for its complexity, but no, I actually hate this place. The team proceeds on to Zophius, where Estelle is really being held, just before quite possibly the most ridiculous sequence of events in the entire game happens. So, for context, Alexei has orchestrated the events of the entire game and is now controlling Estelle within some sort of magic sphere atop the Sword Stair in Zophius, way up in the sky. The party uses Baul, a dragon monster that is functionally the game's airship, to fly directly to Alexei. Yuri jumps from the airship to Estelle, which I should stress is absolutely crazy, and then she's forced to use her powers to push him away. Yuri somehow manages to grab onto a rope as he flies away, and then Estelle blasts the entire airship away from the capital and across the entire continent. When the next scene fades in, we see Baul, every member of the party, and Yuri lying on the ground with only minor injuries. Well, actually, Baul's injuries are severe enough that he's temporarily indisposed, but Yuri, who is literally dangling from a rope with one hand, is fine, so no worries. But it doesn't end there. I'm now going to show you a map of the world in Vesperia. This continent is where all of the current events are taking place. Right here is Zophius, where Estelle is and where the party just was. Here is approximately where everyone landed afterwards. Now, the gang needs to begin a journey to get back to Zophius, but they have to take a detour to get there. This is the path they take. They go up, around the coast, over some ice floes, up and back around a mountain range, and then finally stop in Halure to rest before the last leg of the journey straight to Zophius. Does any of this seem strange to you? Just forget for a moment how everyone is alive and explain to me how long you think it took everybody to walk this distance across an entire continent. I'll wait. Let's try to break this down together. So, we'll assume that when Estelle launched everyone, they landed almost instantly at their destination. Then, when they walked to the harbor and saw a doctor, the doctor healed everyone instantly. Then, they walked all the way to Halure, slept for the night, and then on to Zophius. If this world functioned logically, as it was implied to earlier when the party fled Dawngrest to Heliord and needed a break, this journey should have taken days upon days. Instead, at minimum, the game implies that only 1 day has passed for this entire journey. And even keeping that in mind, when Yuri and his friends reach the top of the Sword Stair in Zophius, Alexei is still there. Why was he just standing there with Estelle the whole time? I'll tell you right now, his plan was to use Estelle's power to raise a shrine from the ocean, but he waits until everyone shows up to stop him to do it. He mentions that it's thanks to the party's arrival that his key is complete, but it's not explained what exactly he means by that statement. I mean, I'm truly baffled here. Unless I'm missing something super obvious, I can't see it as anything other than an oversight. It's just so wacky to try and piece it all together in a logical way that it's clear nobody really thought about it. And to be honest, I never thought about it either until this most recent playthrough. But enough of my tirade. When everyone rests at Halure for the night, Yuri resolves to make it the rest of the way on his own with Rapide, because he knows that he may wind up having to kill Estelle in order to stop her. Not wanting anyone else to bear that burden, he sets off alone and takes a nap in the woods on the way. Fortunately or unfortunately for him, Yuri's friends know him too well and caught up, with Rapide going so far as to lead them right to him. They scold Yuri for being a lone wolf, which is a bit of an on-the-nose way of alluding to his wolf motif, and the journey continues all the way to the top of the sword stair with everyone in tow. Now, do you remember when I said earlier that we'd entered the best stretch of the game? We've since gone through 4 dungeons: the Shrine of Bactian, the Heracles, the Zofair Drifts, and Zophius Castle. We've had to do all of this without Estelle, and now we've come full circle, having gone through Zophius Castle once before as the very first dungeon of the game. We're now face to face with the man behind the events of the entire game, and we're armed with the information that Estelle may need to be killed in order to save her and the world. The tension has been building and building, and it's finally about to release in what I believe to be the absolute climax of the events that unfold in Vesperia's main plot. Alexei uses Estelle to raise Zaude from the ocean, which I mentioned before as a massive and ancient shrine. But it's more than that. Zaude is a super weapon that Alexei hopes to use to dominate the world and force it to follow his well-intentioned ideals. Alexei commands a brainwashed Estelle to attack the group before teleporting away, because he can do that, I guess, as Estelle's powers immobilize everyone but Yuri, who earlier received a plot sword that can neutralize the effect. With no other option, Yuri is forced to defend himself from Estelle, prompting the confrontation that we'd been hoping to avoid until now. I'll just let this play out.
Please, before I can hurt anyone else, please. Kill me.
I'll set you free.
Yuri!
Yuri!
Yuri had known all along that it could come to this, and he doesn't hesitate. His words, "I'll set you free," say so much about his feelings in this moment that it's possibly my favorite line in the whole game. Say what you will about the animation, but this scene nearly brings me to tears every time I see it. As the player, you're tasked with fighting Estelle 1v1 as Yuri as he tries to talk sense into her. If you did a certain side quest earlier, Estelle will have given Yuri a memento given to her by her late mother. Up until now, it's simply taken up space in your inventory, and on use it does basically nothing. But now, if Yuri uses it on Estelle, it will lower her guard to fulfill the requirements for a secret mission and make the fight easier. Whether or not you use the memento, though, Yuri will eventually defeat Estelle, gaining his signature weapon, the second star, and bringing her back to reality.
Come back to us! Estelle! Are you just gonna let your life end like this? Like someone else's tool?
This is admittedly a powerful moment for Estelle. She cries out that she wants to live, something that she'd been struggling with ever since she learned her existence was poison, but could only realize it with Yuri's help. Unfortunately, despite what I just got done saying, this whole sequence after the fight is brought down for me almost immediately for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that's all it took for her to snap out of it? She just has to want to live? I mean, I know it's an anime game, but that's kinda sketchy. There's absolutely something to be said about depression and the lack of a will to live. We just got done seeing it with Raven. But Estelle's case is just so strange in comparison. Everything we know about her up to this point says that she enjoys life a lot, and the only thing that's ever brought her down is that she's a danger to the world. But at most, she said that if she has to die for the greater good, she'll do it. It didn't come off as a statement that she was eager to die or even all that willing. It seemed more like a pragmatic approach. At no point had anyone given up on her either. The team has been in constant support of her and her struggle. Maybe I'm missing the point, but I find it hard to believe that Estelle literally had no will to live until she was beaten half to death. The other reason is that it brings everything Yuri went through up to this point down a fair bit. The whole reason I like the scene earlier as much as I do is because there's an explicit idea planted in your head by the game that you may have to kill your friend, and there's nothing else you can do about it. It's the only option left, and they're even begging for you to do it to free them from torment and torture. There's this sort of deflation almost immediately when you start the fight, and Yuri goes from having basically just said, "I'll kill you, but only because it's necessary," to, "Just snap out of it, buddy." It's even worse that you essentially still kill her in the fight, hacking her to pieces with your sword, but then in the cutscene, all Yuri does is yell at her and then everything's normal again. Had Yuri really had to kill her, through the hands of the player even, I think the ramifications could have been incredibly interesting. Or even better, if the player could have chose to let Estelle kill them, because even though Yuri had the conviction, the player did not. That would have been an amazing bit of gameplay interaction, though I understand that basically would have never been possible. Now, I'm certainly not saying I would have preferred for Estelle to die or anything. I don't hate her nearly as much as I let on from earlier. I'm just of the opinion that the route they went was fairly anticlimactic and almost predictable in a way. You can't just plop a cure materia onto anyone and then call him a healer. Estelle is the only character so far to have any healing spells that are worth a shit, so it's similarly hard to believe that they would have just taken that away from you. In the end, it's basically my fault for falling for such an obvious ploy by the game to exploit my emotion, but I still view the scene in that same wide-eyed context that I always have, and I think it greatly benefits from that perspective. I may be alone on this one though. If you agree or disagree with my opinion on this scene, you should let me know in the comments. I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say about it. Anyways, Estelle is saved and the party prepares for the final battle at Zaude. There's a bunch of running around and talking to the different members of your party to hear what they have to say about the upcoming final battle, and it's nice to see how everyone has come along. Rita's made a lot of progress in showing her affection towards Estelle since the start of the game, and has even softened her overall attitude towards the others. Carol and Rapide can be found lending a helping hand to the refugees of the capital, with Carol continuing to show his strong development and Rapide just being Rapide. You can find Raven contemplating the future in the jail cell you met him in at the start of the game, which is an interesting disparity in attitude and environment. The last party member I haven't at least mentioned yet is Judith, and for good reason. She's funny and snarky as much as anyone else in the cast, but otherwise her defining trait is her sex appeal. I mean, that's really all I have to say about her. She had a short-lived betrayal of the party earlier, but even during my first playthrough of the game, I wasn't really concerned or worried about her not coming back. Her entire character was about saving the world from destruction from the start, so her motivations throughout the entire plot are kind of barren and boring, so I find her to be the weakest character of the bunch. Well, aside from Patty, but I already talked about her earlier. She still hasn't had her identity revealed yet, but even when it is, nothing really changes. Moving quickly to Zaude, the story is slightly altered here to allow for Flynn to join up with the team, although this isn't the first time it's happened. This dungeon is quite impressive looking, and it seems like it might be fairly large before you even set foot inside. Rather fitting for the final dungeon, I suppose. Halfway through, the gang encounters Jaeger, a subordinate of Alexei who has a heart blastia just like Raven. Similarly to Schwann, there's a trick in this fight that allows you to exploit Jaeger's Heart Blastia for some totally awesome gamer points, though this one is much trickier to pull off and actually requires Raven to do.
To say bye-bye. Hey, that hurt! That hurt! Have some day!
You know, I'm not really one for vengeance and all, but this is for the Don.
The team makes short work of Jaeger and moves on to the final chamber, where Alexei awaits. Everything you've done throughout the entire game has culminated in this. Alexei is still working on the formula to control Zaude, so you still have time to stop him. He activates the elevator he was conveniently standing on the whole time and never bothered to use until now, so everyone just kind of jumps aboard with him. Raven tells Alexei that the ends don't always justify the means, fitting words that suit many of the lessons learned throughout the game. Few more words are spared for the bastard Alexei before the fight for control of Zaude begins. Before and during the fight, Alexei really drives home the fact that Raven has turned against him, furthering the confusion about the aforementioned control he was supposed to have over Raven's heart. Alexei is a tough opponent, being the commandant of the Imperial Knights, who have been frequent enemies throughout the game. You've been warned many times about his skill through skits and dialogue, and he's not afraid to show you why.
Damn, he may be crazy, but he still fights like a commandant.
He frequently uses his mystic art, Brilliant Cataclysm, to damage the entire party, and has none of the restrictions for using it that you have on your mystic arts. It's well known for being able to kill every member of your party if they're not topped off, so you'll need to pull out all the stops. He can also use the move Guardian Frost to heal himself for multiple thousands of HP while damaging you if you get too close. Aside from these moves in his raw strength, you should be able to succeed if you persevere long enough, and he has no additional phases. Bring him down to 0 HP and you'll be able to finish him off and save the world.
You are finished. Very well. I think that's enough for now.
Now the law will give you your due punishment.
You'll be stripped of your title as Commandant.
Congratulations on beating the game. Not. If you've played the game before or otherwise saw through mine and the game's ruse, you'll have realized that this isn't really the end. Alexei had the formula continue to work in the background during your battle. When defeated, Alexei activates Zaude and unleashes catastrophe upon the world. But not how you or he imagined. As the camera zooms out, we see that Vesperia, the brightest star in the sky, isn't actually a star at all. Zaude fires upon it, opening a massive hole in the sky from which an enormous eldritch being reveals itself. The star, Vesperia, and the weapon, Zaude, are actually a giant barrier blastia covering the entire world and protecting it from an ancient being mentioned only a few times until now, the Autophagos. Alexei's mind immediately snaps, having realized what he's done, and is cut down by Yuri shortly before being completely crushed by the core of Zaude. Amidst the confusion, Flynn's second-in-command decides to take the law into her own hands and stabs Yuri, sending him tumbling from the top of the giant structure. And so ends Act 2 of 3. You can probably tell by how much I've had to say about Act 2 that I vastly prefer it to Act 1, and you'd be right in that conclusion. Interesting bits of story happen one after another, and most of the dungeons have great atmosphere. The pacing also feels better than ever. As soon as Estelle is kidnapped, there's a powerful motivation to proceed with the story as soon as you can after each step. What's more, everything leading up to Alexei has been a long time coming, so everyone refers to it as the upcoming final battle. So as soon as Estelle is safe, you find yourself thinking that you only have one dungeon to go, and there's no time to waste. That is, until the last scene where the game reveals it all to have been a fake-out last boss. Alexei's motivations aren't crystal clear in-game, but his actions define him well enough to make him a decent villain, especially in comparison to some of the others who came before him. The reveal of the Autophagos in particular is a really interesting twist. It isn't talked about much before this point, but the idea that Alexei released it by mistake, in the anticipation that you have to actually fight the thing, it's an awesome buildup of tension and a great subversion to what seemed like a fairly by-the-numbers story about an egomaniac villain. I really do love everything that's led to this moment in the plot, so it's a shame that I have to tell you that we've now covered the best of what the game has to offer in terms of narrative. Before we move on to Act 3 though, it's time for me to get something off my chest. I have a huge issue with the way that the definitive edition was handled. This stuff is an unholy mess. I heard a lot of chatter before the game came out about Troy Baker not reprising his role for Yuri, and although I think it's an issue not to at least ask him to come back, I think it's an even bigger issue that they thought this would fly at all. Let me start from the beginning for those unaware. When the Xbox 360 version released, the game had a huge amount of dialogue you needed to go through for the story that was completely unvoiced. When they ported the game to the PS3, they decided to go back and have the voice actors record lines for every mandatory scene in the main story. I don't have exact numbers, but I'd venture to guess that there were just as many lines unvoiced as there were voiced. So it was a huge amount of new recordings. Of course, as we all know by now, that was only in Japan. Now, 10 years later, English-speaking countries are getting the same treatment since we just now got this content, but the massive time frame between now and the initial release means that some major changes had to be made. For example, both Yuri and Judith's voice actors in the definitive edition are new. That means that in any of those newly recorded lines I mentioned, a completely different person speaks when these characters talk.
Go missing? No one even makes a fuss. When just one is enough to throw the lower quarter into chaos. If they got cores to spare, they could stand to give us some.
Looks like the nobles are living the sweet life as usual. The lower quarter is right there. They still don't give a damn.
And that extends to any new attacks that they've added in this version of the game.
Roaring Revolution! Blazing Tempest! Delight Roll! Sylphie Roll! Ha! Crescent Strike! Dawn Moon Falcon!
It's not even enough to call this stuff jarring. I envy the people that say that they can't tell the difference between the new lines and the old lines, because really, how does this not just completely take you out of the moment?
Ha! Ta! Ha! Ha! Azure Edge!
Concealed Blade!
Ha! Ta! Ha! Ha!
Draconian Slash!
Ha! Ha!
Shredding Palm!
Out of my way!
And when I say that, I say it not because Grant George is a bad voice actor. He doesn't sound anything like Yuri most of the time in my opinion, but he has a handful of lines throughout the game that sounded actually pretty on point. The problem is that it's 10 years apart. Namco Bandai are the ones who decided to wait so long, so they should have prepared for it. They could have re-recorded old lines, or at least spent more time with the new ones. In Judith's case, I could actually see her voice actress completely replacing the old one. I don't feel the same way about Yuri, but that's my problem. At least you wouldn't have this embarrassment on your hands. Plenty of small-time characters were replaced too, with LeBlanc and the Dawn deserving special mention for just how jarring their new lines were. They're not quite as important or impactful as the main characters, but hearing Jamison Price, the voice actor of Duke of all people, voicing 2 more characters in the game.
This was only a distortion. It is a natural occurrence.
There ain't been too many lively youngsters around here lately, so I've grown bored.
Through its power and the secret phrase handed down, the wall's true form is revealed.
I mean, you might as well just let Troy Baker come back just to voice Regay's new lines. You know what I mean? How could you not get someone else? Or just re-record the few lines they already had with new people? As for the lines themselves, I'm not kidding when I say they made me flinch.
Yuri Lowell, you've given my 2 lackeys a headache. Now be a good boy and turn yourself in.
Yuri Lowell! I know you're here in these woods! Turn yourself in like a good boy!
Now what's with all of you? Just how you figure coming down here be the smart thing to do?
Who's that little kid? Sorry about that. Patty, huh? Why don't you come over here and show me your face?
Of all the... Why'd she have to wind up like this?
There are issues with the returning voice actors as well. A decade has passed, so obviously a lot of their voices have changed slightly, or their memories as to how to perform these characters have faded. Michelle Ruff as Rita has a different tone when she speaks for her new lines. They seem drawn out, almost as if she's more tired.
So, you're all planning on looking for this pharaoh by going to the sands of Kogor. Do you really plan on helping Estelle find that pharaoh whatever? Didn't that thing say that Estelle was an insipid poison or something?
In fact, it was my opinion that the majority of new lines for every party member except Estelle sounded different enough to discern without any obvious cues like Patty being on screen. Really, Estelle I struggled to hear a difference at all, but she's literally the only example I can think of done this well in the main cast.
Yes, that's why I'm going to the City of Blossoms, Halor. We can't do that. It'll get in the way of other people passing through.
Regardless of how well they were done, though, it seems that whoever did the voice direction for both new and returning voice actors hadn't ever actually played Vesperia. Names of places change depending on old and new lines. From Heliord to Heliord.
I showed up at Heliord. Are you forgetting what happened in Heliord?
Kados to Kados.
Are you going to the Wiesent of Kados?
I'm headed for the Air Crane and the Wiesent of Kados. Well, the Wiesent of Kados is blocked off.
From Zaude to Zod.
The Enduring Shrine of Zaude.
The Enduring Shrine of Zaude.
I'm going to the Shrine of Zaude.
It came from the direction of Zaude. Alexei seemed to believe Zod was a weapon.
It continued to power Zod as a virtually perpetual formula.
You did say you'd investigated Zod, didn't you?
Were you able to withstand Zod's attacks?
I mean, if you're gonna record new stuff, at least have the courtesy to maintain some consistency instead of having people guess as to the pronunciation of these made-up words. While on the topic of the team having never played Vesperia, I have to wonder if they've ever played Tales in general. The translated names of some of the attacks are series staples that were totally changed for no reason. Flynn's Hellfire Blade should be Hellpire, and Severing Blade should be Severing Wind to be consistent with other Tales games, but the team working on Vesperia DE just didn't know or care, I guess. So we get a clumsy transliteration that's at odds with the rest of the modern franchise. Just go and look at the wiki and you'll see these little addendums for Vesperia DE. I mean, that's all they had to do. Just look at the wiki. Some moves had no basis though, meaning those are hit or miss depending on your preference. I mean, I like Heavenly Bladewing compared to Angel's Crest or Brilliant Phoenix, but considering those had no earlier incarnations, I have no qualm with whatever they choose. All of those complaints could be considered subjective though, so you probably have your doubts about what I've been saying so far. I mean, who cares who voices Yuri? He's still the same character, right? It wouldn't matter if his second Mystic art was called Big Feather. He does the same thing. And if you thought either of those things, then I can't really argue with you. But if you need an objective issue with Vesperia DE pointed out, look no further than the audio issues. This stuff is sad, and I really mean that. I could look past all the other stuff, however begrudgingly. I mean, I could just switch to Japanese audio, and then I would never have to actually listen to Grant George. But I see this issue in particular as a statement. That Vesperia Definitive Edition is just a quick money grab. When I heard my first new skit, I was shocked that they could let something like that exist in a modern game.
I had thought that amnesia was only in stories.
It happens all the time. Get caught up in an explosion during a failed Blastia experiment, and there go all your memories.
It's like this. Skits pulled directly from the original game are completely fine, just like you remember them. When you activate them, the volume of the characters speaking is just loud enough over the noise in the background to be clear at default volume levels. In contrast, any new skits or skits that needed to be changed by adding Patty or Flynn are very quiet and poorly compressed, leading to bad sound quality and skits being sometimes hard to hear. It's like they put me in charge of the sound quality for their game. Just me, with the setup I'm using right now. In one instance in Gasfrost, I struggled to hear what anyone was saying at all over the sound of the gears, whereas original skits sounded just fine.
Also a member of your party?
Yeah, he doesn't get along too well with people, though. Don't let it get to you.
I'm Judith. Nice to meet you.
Hey, why is he letting Judith pet him? Flynn, didn't you come here with Zodiac?
I did. Zodiac and the others were busy arresting and taking for gold, so I'm on my own.
Should a lieutenant leave his subordinates when they have to be like that?
If there are any audio issues with regular scenes, I couldn't tell. But all of this indicates to me that the entire process of bringing Vesperia DE to the West was done in a very sloppy manner, just to get it out the door. As much as I like Troy Baker, I absolutely urge everyone to play with Japanese audio so that you don't have to deal with these frankly insufferable audio issues. And now, before we move on to Act 3, I'll indulge myself by having you listen to these comparisons between Troy Baker Yuri and Grant George Yuri.
We've run into each other a couple times.
What do you mean, how? We walked. As in, across the desert.
That's true. How about we leave tomorrow? Rita, one day should be enough, right?
You're welcome. Okay then, we'll meet up near the exit tomorrow morning.
I don't give a damn what you're doing this for, but you're making a lot of people cry. And that's enough of a reason to take you down!
Everyone, jump!
No!
Flynn!
This hill's pretty brutal. They are tenacious.
Whoa, Patty! Where did you come from? If you're both done messing around. We just saw Harry. Did something happen to him?
Hold on, forget the explanation. We wouldn't understand it anyway. There'll be a lot of unhappy people, but we have to do it.
Otherwise, the world will fall to the Autophagos, even if no one else ever understands why.
Come, O power!
Shine, light of the morning star! Try some of this! Heavenly Bladewing!
Alright, who's next? Alright, who's next?
We're done here.
Divine Wolf Storm! Come, O profound righteousness, foundation of the world! This is it! Brilliant Phoenix!
Yuri wakes up in his bed at home to find that he was saved by Duke, a mysterious character that we've had a number of run-ins with so far. He was the one to loan Yuri the plot sword from earlier, and saved his life as an aside to retrieving the weapon. The amount of time from when Yuri fell from Zaude until now isn't disclosed, but the moment he leaves his house, Estelle and Rapide arrive. Since the battle with Alexei, everyone had split up to accomplish their own tasks, with some of them giving the impression that it's been a few days or weeks since then. So my question is, why didn't anyone check Yuri's house before? They really didn't think to go where he lived until seconds before he got up? Maybe I'm reading too much into this one though, considering the game so far has a precedent for not really following logical time frames. Anyways, the gang reunites in a world where the Autophagos now constantly looms overhead. If you notice some of the earlier clips having a sort of purplish tint to them, this is why. The overworld and battle music has changed one final time to match the mood of this endangered world. Having said that though, nothing really seems to be happening. Even during whatever amount of time Yuri needed to recover from his fall, nobody really mentions any particular Autophagos related event. It's just stated or known that it will eventually consume the world in some fashion. At one point, the gang does head to Nordopolica to defend it from the Autophagos, but this seems to be the only attack that occurs, and only because of unusual circumstances. From Yuri's fall to the end of the game, I'm not sure how much time passes, but this is literally the only event that occurs in which the Autophagos does anything at all. Not really reassuring, is it? Of course, that's a bit of meta information from me, and the party doesn't know that nothing will happen, so everybody has to try and find a solution to get rid of it. During one such conversation, we hear for the first and only time in the story the track from the title screen, Dawn of Departure. Now, let me start off by saying that I think the game has an overall decent soundtrack. I like the music, and I can whistle along to it, but I don't find it to be super memorable. I mean, you know, some games, especially JRPGs, they just have these amazing, super catchy soundtracks, and you just hear them play in your head over and over on repeat. But Vesperia has something more mellow, I suppose, is the best way to put it. I don't think that any particular tracks are very bad, and the soundtrack is overall consistent, but it's almost too consistent, if you know what I'm saying. It can be easy to confuse some tracks with others from this game and even some from other games within the franchise by the same composer. A lot of it just sounds similar. And I don't really consider myself an audiophile despite how much I've been talking about voice work and music. I'm just trying to say that this is all my opinion. I do definitely think that there are some very, very good tracks. I've been playing some of them throughout this video. But back to the main topic, Dawn of Departure. I always thought that this was kind of a boring song. Or at least I used to. I mean, it's kind of hard not to feel that way when you're hot off the heels of Ring a Bell, which had way more energy behind it. But now, I see it in a new light. From the start of the game until now, it feels like we've really come a long way. That point when Yuri is standing on a hill, overlooking the capital with nothing but Rapide in his sword, which, by the way, is the sword that he got from fighting Estelle. Overlooking the capital that, until the beginning of this game, he had never left. Back then, the departure was the beginning of Yuri's journey and ours alongside him. But this time, Yuri's come up with a plan that involves a different kind of departure. One that will see the world moving forward with a new way of life. It gives a lot of meaning to the track for me, which is something that's lost for a lot of the other music, simply because they're used so often or bleed into each other. When we finish the game, we'll be booted back to the title screen one more time to hear it, with New Game Plus beginning the cycle again. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that it's always a powerful moment when you finish a game, watch the outro, and then sit in silence at the main menu one last time to reflect on what's happened. But we're not quite at that point yet. We still have to deal with the Autophagos. Considering it's basically a giant tentacle monster in the sky, it's unreasonable to assume that we'd be able to just cut it. Other than sending those monsters from earlier to attack Nordopolica, its greater abilities, if any, are unknown. It was created from excess consumption of air by Blastia. Estelle's power, the one that makes her a poison, contributes even more towards this process, which is why Pharaoh wanted to kill her earlier. If you can't tell by now, it's a metaphor for polluting the world. It's kind of shoved in your face, and it sort of comes out of left field compared to all the stuff we've been dealing with until now. It was certainly alluded to, and Blastia have absolutely been a major theme throughout the game, but it's at such a contrast to everything thus far that it throws most other subplots out the window so that everyone can focus on the big bad monster in the sky. Duke, the white-haired guy from earlier, had previously been traveling the world in an effort to restrain the air and prevent such a disaster from occurring. Now that it's too late to stop the Autophagos from appearing, Duke plans to raise the ancient tower Tarkaron, which is a city-turned weapon, and use it to absorb the life force of all humans to destroy the Autophagos. Then the planet can revert to its primal state. Great plan, dude. Of course, pretty much everyone in the world wants to live for some reason, so it's up to Yuri and company to stop him and enact their alternative plan to stop the Autophagos. What is the alternative plan? Well, to be honest, I never really understood all the technobabble about it, so I can't for sure say what the intention was initially. Something about turning air into mana, reducing how much gets fed to the Autophagos. It's not really important though, because the plan doesn't exactly work as expected, and instead ends up creating an elemental spirit. With the knowledge that spirits can be created, the party plans to collect some important and rare items to convert into more spirits of the remaining major elements and further their new plan. I'm skipping over some details, but who cares? It's at this point that the game allows you to freely choose which of the two available dungeons you want to go to first. though the game not so subtly hints which you should prioritize. I always compare this moment in my mind to when you can choose from the Earth Temple or the Wind Temple in Wind Waker, since you've been pretty much stuck on a straight path since the beginning, and this is basically the only time you're given any sort of choice. Neither dungeon takes a particularly large amount of time, and when you're finished with them, there's only one real major story element left before the final dungeon, making the third act definitely the shortest regarding the plot. I want to point out that one of these two dungeons has a special remix of the battle theme for whatever reason, and I never understood why. It's the only time any of the three main battle themes get remixed, and the area really isn't that much more special than other places. It looks pretty though. And so, the finalized plan that the heroes have come up with goes like this. Rita will use her knowledge to create a locus in the form of a sword. This will channel the 4 major spirits that the party has created, as well as lesser spirits from every single Blastia in the world, in order to destroy the Autophagos. This means that technology as the world knows it will be forfeited, ranging from the barriers that protect people from monsters, all the way down to simple lamps, and even the special Blastia that people like Yuri use to perform arts. The issue I mentioned earlier about Raven's heart comes into play now as well. It's not explicitly stated if giving up the Blastia means giving up his heart as well, but as we eventually see in the ending credits, he makes it just fine. I'm not exactly sure why that is. His heart Blastia runs on life energy instead of air, but I don't quite see why that would exempt him, other than maybe it doesn't run off of a core? I can't recall if that's ever stated either, but the internal logic of how made-up Magitech works isn't really worth dissecting in my opinion. The sacrifice of the Blastia is considered necessary by the leaders of the world, and the party makes plans to set out for Tarkaron to stop Duke, as well as get as close as possible to the Autophagos itself. Yuri and Flynn finally have a proper duel together and come to terms with each other's choices, though this conveniently forgets that Yuri has yet to actually answer for his very real crimes in the past. Yuri vs. Flynn isn't an amazing battle in terms of complexity or difficulty, but it has an absolutely jamming track, as well as being very cathartic. Yuri and Flynn act differently when it's just themselves, and it's refreshing to see them let loose. Reminds me of real friendship. This is the point in time on the 360 that you would have finally realized that Flynn is never going to join your party, though in the updated version this is actually where he finally joins permanently. Everyone pairs off to have one last heart-to-heart, and we cross off the final major story beat before the last boss. But before we get there, about 100 side quests have just become available. Not literally, but there are a lot. As a matter of fact, lots of them have been cropping up since the start of the game, but I figured I'd save them until now to talk about. If the term side quest makes you think of optional fetch quests or quest logs and map markers, then let me stop you right there. In Vesperia, side quests are optional events that become available after certain story beats. There's no menu or in-game tracking system for them, nor is there any indication when one has become available. Even worse than that, lots of these side quests similarly become unavailable after you progress further or fail to complete an earlier step. What this amounts to is that if you don't follow a guide of some sort as early as possible into your playthrough, you're almost guaranteed to miss the vast majority of side quests in the game, as well as the rewards that follow. Once Tarkaron becomes available, there are no more checkpoints to reach that will cut you off, so from here you can spend as much time as you want in order to finish up anything you've missed that also happens to be available. You should probably hurry though, considering the fate of the entire world is at stake, although nobody really seems to care too much on how long it ends up taking. With the sheer amount of side quests on offer, some of them are bound to be fairly inconsequential. Your reward for side quests always features some sort of cutscene to flesh out a character or the world, but can otherwise contain an actual prize. Plenty of them simply give you titles, which are only really relevant to people hoping to get 100% completion in the game or really want bunny ears. But there are just as many that offer tangible rewards, like one-of-a-kind weapons and costumes. Okay, Tortoise Stew, 1. Yep. Okay, that's it. Mandragoso, 9 Mandragoso. Nope, wait, never mind, forget it. A Mongo tea, 5 tea. Okay, now that's easy. Hold on, everyone. Ice cream, 12 ice creams for you, little guy. Tortoise Stew, 8 Tortoise Stew, 12 ice cream, 8 Tortoise Stew. Rat Pig Steak, 10 steak. Nope, no, never mind, forget that. 12 ice cream, shrimp. Wait, whoa, I forgot, what am I doing? An example of one line of side quests in Vesperia starts near the beginning of the game, before you enter the first overworld dungeon and meet Carol. When in Dayton Hold, you can actually find and speak with Duke if you decide to explore a bit. While this side quest offers no physical reward, you can continue to meet Duke 6 more times for this side quest alone throughout the game, but only if you met him this first time, which becomes unavailable once you catch up with Flynn, with each subsequent meeting having a similar cutoff. And that's just one example. If you don't care about Duke, you can always find and hunt down the legendary Giganto monsters. These guys are, as their name suggests, giant monsters that exist throughout the world. You can actually see one in the background of the Koi Woods when you're forced to run back and forth like 4 times near the start of the game. These guys can be considered optional bosses, and most of them can be quite tough depending on when you decide to challenge them, but they offer rewards to a side quest. That is, if you start the side quest before you kill any. You see, you can actually find your first Giganto monster very early in the game, or at least this version. The Green Menace can be found in Cave Mock, and although he might be challenging, you can defeat him if you try hard enough. If you decided not to sleep at the King of Adventure Inn a couple times earlier in the game, then killing the Green Menace, or any other Giganto monster, forfeits your ability to collect the rewards of the side quest, which is at no point explained to you or indicated in the slightest. If this happens to you, you'll quite literally have no idea unless you stumble across it on a repeat playthrough or learn about it from outside the game. And that's far from the worst example. For me, that honor would go to the swimsuit side quest. In the port of the game, a side quest was added that would allow you to acquire swimsuits for all of your party members. First, you have to do what amounts to a very easy fetch quest to retrieve an item from the ice region and return it to the quest giver, which unlocks all of the male swimsuits, which is a very nice reward, but let's be real, it's not what any of us, including Raven, want. To get the female costumes, you're provided with a similar task, but the hint as to where to go is incredibly vague. The solution to the puzzle is to go talk to a man named Giovanni, standing by a fountain in Halure. Sounds easy, right? Well, who is Giovanni? Giovanni is a random NPC that you can accidentally run into at the town of Ospio earlier in the game if you've seen at least 50% of the items in the game. And trust me, that's a lot. I was going for 100% from the outset of the game, and I only got to about 60% by the time I finished the story. You may not even reach that number by the end of your first playthrough if you're going in blind. Anyways, the real problem here comes when you realize that Ospio gets destroyed when the final dungeon Tarkaron rises into the sky. If you haven't figured it out by now, I'll give you a second to try and work it out. That's right. If you failed to see half of the items in the game and walk into the Inn of Ospio before it's permanently unavailable, for which there is no significant or obvious reason to do, then you have just thrown away the ability to finish a completely unrelated side quest for some swimsuit costumes. Your only other option at this point is to go through the entire game again on New Game Plus, having carried over your collector's book progress, and making absolutely sure to walk into Ospio Inn at the correct point of the game. It's really just absurd when I think about it, and there are even more examples I could list off, but I don't want to keep you here all day. The point is that a lot of interesting and meaningful content in Vesperia is gated away behind invisible time barriers that most players are unlikely to even know about. You could make the argument that most of this stuff is intended for a repeat playthrough of the game anyways, especially since these costumes in particular come so late, but I think that's a cop-out. You are quite literally able to do this and nearly every single other side quest in the game on your first playthrough, and there's tons of post-game time that you could spend utilizing these rewards. If they wanted you to wait until your next playthrough, then why didn't they make it a grade shop purchase? Or make the reward only available in New Game Plus? This isn't like the Dawn boss fight where it's hopelessly difficult the first time through by design. At least you know that. The game doesn't try to hide that fact, because as soon as you scan him the first time and see how over-leveled he is, it's obvious that you're not supposed to win. These side quests are just an obfuscation of relevant info to the player. What purpose does that serve? I also think it's a shame that I have to follow a guide whenever I want to play the game, because there's no way for me to memorize the absurd amount of events and when they appear. If you realistically wanted to avoid using a guide, your only hope would be to stop after every single story event and return to every location in the game while talking to every NPC. How is that fun or fair? I love Vesperia to death, and I've made mention of a lot of ups and downs throughout this video, but when it comes to the core gameplay itself, I think this is absolutely the worst and most unforgivable facet of the game. I'm at least pleased to say that they've made steps in more recent Tales games to fix this issue. Once inside the ancient tower of Tarkaron, the party makes their way up to Duke. The entire place can only be described as twisted. Strange monsters wander all over, and parts of the tower are alien. The entire place seems like a labyrinth, but it's deceptively straightforward like most dungeons. You can't really wander too far off in an incorrect direction before reaching a dead end, so the only thing stopping you from progressing is getting confused by the similar looking layouts. Despite that, I think that Tarkaron is possibly the most memorable dungeon in the game aside from the Crystal Lands, if not for just how good the atmosphere is. We can't fly to the top because reasons, which unfortunately means we run into Zagi. You may or may not know who Zagi is, just as you may or may not remember that I mentioned his name way earlier. Zagi was the first boss of the game, an insane assassin hunting for Flynn. Yuri bested him, which started Zagi on an obsessive quest to find and kill Yuri. This time, in Tarkaron, we're meeting him for our 5th time, his body having been warped by a Blastia arm that gives him more power. He seals the way forward and begs for the party to fight him without restraint. Of course, we defeat him just like any other, but considering Zagi has actually managed to survive multiple times now, Yuri makes an effort to condemn Zagi to a more permanent fate, which is just another tally for Yuri's cool moments scoreboard.
Yuri! Do it in hell.
Zagi wasn't particularly interesting as a character, which is why I haven't really brought him up, but Yuri's ruthless slaying of him, with Flynn being the only person to make even an effort to stop him, says a lot about every single person in the room. Now that we're largely unimpeded, we can continue our ascent, facing similar obstacles as before. There's a rolling ball puzzle part-way through, but I struggle to even call it that. It's just like all of the others in Vesperia's various dungeons, mostly requiring you to shoot stuff until something happens. There are also numerous elevators on the way up, but all of them are turned off, so don't bother. At least the devs were kind enough to give you a fast way around for later, which is more than I can say for most dungeons. Once we finally reach the top, we can find a Duke in a surprisingly serene area. Here, a conversation between the party and Duke will play out, which ends with a final back and forth between Duke and the character you're playing at the time. You can even play as Rapide, which causes Duke to mention that Rapide won't actually die from the power of Tarkaron, so he doesn't need to fight. Of course, this won't stop our goodest boy.
I would not wish for your death, but if you stand in my way, I will have no choice. Come!
Duke is absolutely the hardest fight so far, not counting the Dawn. He teleports around, dishing out status ailments left and right. Of course, this first fight is just a taste of what's to come. I mean, what would a last boss be without multiple phases? The fight transitions onto a glyph in the sky as Duke takes his second form. Covered in white light, Duke looks like some sort of god, and his power increases tremendously. He has a large amount of stagger resistance, continues to inflict status effects, and now has access to the mystic art Big Bang, which does an immense amount of unavoidable damage to all party members, usually bringing the team down to 1 HP before moving in to kill them all. His constant teleporting makes it hard to connect certain attacks, and he likes to break out of combos extremely quickly. Duke has a red version of Demon Fang called Shock Thrust, and an attack called Punishing Descend. Also, I can't tell, is that a misspelled word or is that something I've never heard of? Anyways, if you pay close attention, you'll notice that Duke has a couple of similarly named attacks to Yuri's. There have been clues dropped along the way, but this serves as another example to show the connection between the two, and I've always found it interesting. If Yuri uses his mystic art Savage Wolf Fury on Duke to finish him, an extension is performed to complete the final secret mission, and the game finally and truly ends. Or does it? Generally speaking, this actually is the end of the game. Duke's second form is the intended final boss of Vesperia. That said, the party had the opportunity to travel the world before fighting Duke, collecting all sorts of things to help them finish the journey. The Fell Arms are a series of weapons that have a side quest tied to them. Once you collect the first one, you need to explore a remote island to power up your Sorcerer's Ring, and then return to older areas to collect some more. You also have to collect 2 more Fell Arms for Patty and Flynn in one of the new extra dungeons, as well as the remaining 2 in Tarkaron itself. Upon inspection, they aren't very strong, but having all 9 of them in the presence of Duke when defeating him has an unexpected reaction. A new cutscene will play where Duke claims that the king of the Entelakea has taken his side and granted him strength. Now, the real fight begins. Whereas Duke's second form was level 65, this form of Duke is significantly stronger at level 82, and has taken on not only a new appearance, but a new name. Radiant Winged One. Now, Duke is even harder to stagger, and he's gained 7 new moves to reflect the original party members, like Phantom Wolf and Moonbeam. What's more, the Radiant Winged One has a new mystic art. This attack combines the mystic arts of the original 7 members, and will not spare them at 1 HP like Big Bang. And the cherry on top of it all is that it restores 33% of his total HP, meaning this fight can get grueling.
Brave Vesperia!
This is arguably the hardest fight in the original version of the game.
What is happening? Bring them back from the abyss of death! Resurrection! Is everyone okay? I'm okay! Oh, breath of life that dwells in all creatures, come forth!
I'll blow you away! I'll blow you away! Healing circle! Prepare! Toll the beginning of time! Be gone!
Let's finish this! Blade of cold steel! Rend the infinite darkness! Crush my enemies to nothing! Savage Wolf!
Duke, you're through! There's no getting up from that.
You have lost!
With the final boss defeated for absolute 100% real this time, the Guild of Brave Vesperia enacts their plan to convert the world Blastia into spirits. Though successful, the power isn't enough, and it isn't until Duke himself decides that mankind is worth protecting that he steps in to help with Dane Nomos. Yuri, Duke, and the others combine their efforts and cut a swath through the Autophagos, destroying it and converting what it had absorbed into additional spirits.
Come on!
With the world saved, brave Vesperia celebrates as the new spirits heal the planet. And there you have it, the story of Tales of Vesperia, albeit a really condensed version. I'm not gonna lie, it's far from my favorite ending to a video game. I've come to appreciate it for what it is, but I was incredibly frustrated with it when I first saw it. The Autophagos itself puts up no real fight, and Duke, despite having a compelling conflict with the party at his core, doesn't really do anything to solidify himself as a memorable antagonist. Once he decides to kill everyone with Tarkaron, he just zips away and that's it. Nothing happens until you fight him because he isn't willing to let you try your own strategy first, and when you defeat him, it's another case of someone changing heart instantly because they had conveniently forgotten the actual ideals of the very person they were taking revenge for. Who is Duke acting like in this instance? Shadow. It's Shadow the Hedgehog. Admittedly, it's pretty cool to see Yuri channel the big feather sword, but then the game just ends. The credits serve as an epilogue of sorts, but it feels like we got here way too fast. We didn't have enough time with the Autophagos in the world to absorb the actual danger it presented. It can summon daybreakers. Wow, really scary. I think the issue here is that, as the player, there's no satisfaction in having defeated it. When you beat Barbos, for instance, you feel good because he's been hounding you ever since you found out he stole the Aquablastia. When Yuri beats Flynn, he shouts,
I won?
And you feel especially accomplished to have been the driving force in that underdog victory. In either instance, you feel that way because the game took time to set up these characters. But the final boss was just some guy we only had fleeting encounters with, especially if you didn't follow the side quest. And he wasn't even your enemy in the end. The ultimate bad guy in Vesperia is a faceless, voiceless creature that has no motives and basically never even moves. And that's why I think Vesperia's ending is weak. If you defeated the Radiant Winged One, the true power of the Fell Arms is awakened, each one gaining a permanent +1 physical and magical attack whenever the owner kills an enemy. This number has been building throughout your entire playthrough, from before you even knew what a Fell Arm was, and so your main character's Fell Arm is likely many times stronger than their best weapon in the game. Obviously, this breaks any sort of balance that you might have been hoping to achieve, but the upside is that you don't have to wield it if you don't want to. Once you save the game, a few more things will now be available to you. You can import your save to use in New Game Plus, or you can resume your current progress from before Duke, albeit with your Fell Arms powered up and even more goodies available. This includes an extra dungeon called the Labyrinth of Memories that was available in the original game, featuring Kratos from Tales of Symphonia as the final boss, and the opening of the remaining floors in the Necropolis of Nostalgia, where the Spiral Draco himself awaits. If you go the route of your current save, the Labyrinth of Memories is a good place to start. Of course, you need to have done the necessary side quest much earlier in the game to even continue to unlock it, but that's par for the course at this point. This place is a maze of portals with souped up versions of old bosses, including some optional ones that you might have never even seen until now. If this map of the area makes you sick, then don't worry, it's not as bad as it looks. You generally only have 1 or 2 choices, and you'll get to the end regardless of what path you take. If you're someone hoping to complete everything in the game, then it's worth noting that every single one of these bosses can and must be scanned to complete your monster book, because they count as separate from their originals. Though I suppose if you've been keeping up with it in the first place, that much is probably obvious. You need to run through this place a couple times at least in order to collect the necessary amount of fake gold to enter the final room with Kratos. He's not as hard as the Radiant Winged one, especially if you decide to cheese your way through with your Fell Arm, but it's a fun cameo for fans, and defeating him is a step to unlock a further challenge at the game's Coliseum, where even more cameo battles and prizes await. If you can't tell by now, seemingly everything you do in this game is connected to the greater picture, which is just one of the reasons that going for completion is so fun. The Coliseum has a variety of challenges available in this version of the game, giving you the option to take on hordes of enemies with one character or a team. To unlock further levels of difficulty and therefore prizes, you need to have, and I know, I'm sorry I keep repeating myself, you need to have completed various side quests up to this point. The ultimate challenge of the solo brawl is the 200-man melee. This'll see you bringing a single character of your choosing into the arena with hordes of regular enemies and occasional boss fights. The enemies get harder the further you go, and the character you bring will affect the rewards you receive upon completion. The final boss here is disappointingly just Kratos again, this version being weaker to account for you being solo. On the bright side, there's a really cool Easter egg to unlock here, Rita's second mystic art. Something that I've mentioned before wasn't in the original game. You're probably sick of me saying that by now too, huh? After using the spell Thunderblade 200 times, you must enter the 200-man melee as Rita. Once you reach Douse, you have to reduce his HP below half, enter Overlimit 4, and then cast Thunderblade. That probably seems kind of obtuse and random, but like a lot of things in this game, there is a reason for it, and whether or not you appreciate it likely depends on how long it took you to figure out. If you followed the steps correctly, Rita would be expected to just cast Thunderblade, but instead, the game will change to a short cutscene of sorts, and Rita will cast Indignation.
Thunderblade! I who stand in the full light of the heaven, call upon thee who openeth the gates of hell. Come forth, divine lightning! This ends now! Indignation!
No. Impossible. No.
Douse is the antagonist for the very first Tales game, and Indignation was the very first spell to ever be shown, used against him in the opening cutscene. It's been featured in many games since, so it's got a bit of a reputation. It's probably like seeing the spell Ultima in Final Fantasy. Maybe. I'm not sure. Is Ultima supposed to be cool? Rita will now have access to Indignation permanently for future use, even against little baby enemies. All of the other characters' second mystic arts are similarly obscure, requiring you to beat the game to perform them, but most of them don't have quite the same history. Though there is an interesting case to be had with Twin Wave, which is Yuri and Flynn's joint mystic art. It's the only one of its kind in the game, and it's a bit of a rarity in the series as a whole. It's also annoying as hell to pull off, and in my experience is basically never worth it except to be stylish. To perform Twin Wave, you must have completed what I consider to be a pretty good side quest, which involves nothing more than just returning to the lower quarter after visiting Tarkaron. Yuri and Flynn will receive a powerful sword that holds the hopes of their friends, as well as the title Hope of the Town. Next, they'll need to have used Guardian Field, Azure Edge, and Demon Fang over 200 times each. Then, they must both enter Overlimit 4, which is a lot harder than it sounds. You either need to exploit the usage of Overlimit bottles really quickly, get lucky with Overlimit related skills, or straight up just have 8 bars of Overlimit to spend. Then, all that's left to do is perform an arcane or burst art as either Yuri or Flynn, while holding the buttons for attack, block, and art. Undoubtedly the most complicated move to perform in Vesperia, but also quite possibly the strongest. The last important place that I want to talk about is the Necropolis of Nostalgia, which I keep calling the Telescopic Graveyard on accident, because that was the name the community used before the definitive edition gave us an official one. This place is a fucking nightmare. I know that sounds harsh, but I mean it. You have to do a side quest to get here, just like everything else, but this one graciously isn't missable. There are 6 layers to the dungeon, each with 10 floors. When you reach a new floor, you're given a map on the ground directing you as to how to reach the next one. You have to memorize this map and then proceed into a series of battles that require you to pick an adjoining room to enter afterwards. If you wait too long to pick a new room, the enemies in the current one respawn and you have to kill them again, and it all ends up as one continuous battle until you reach the next floor. If you stick around long enough, you'll probably have lots of level ups and skills learned by the end of a floor. But there's a safety net that kicks you out with no rewards if you try to farm the exact same room over and over, so you have to move around every so often. I like the idea of this place. It's an interesting gimmick. No other place in the game does anything remotely as close to this arena, aside from the fights with maybe Barbos and Bellius off the top of my head, but those are hardly the same thing. I also like the idea that you have to find your way through a bit of a maze, while testing your ability to last long enough to survive as a team. Unfortunately, that's about where the positives end, in my opinion. The first thing that drags this place down is that everything looks exactly the same. I concede that it makes sense to keep things the same on an individual floor to confuse you, but between different floors, when there's no need to keep the scenery the same for the maze, they don't bother changing the background, the floor, or anything. You end up staring at the exact same layout for a very long time. Even outside of the battles, every new floor is just you running around a cylindrical chamber to the next door. The only things here are save points and warp pads to escape the place. I get it's a big tomb and all, and that was interesting in the first section, absorbing the fact that there are so many dead people in one place. But you just spend way too much time here. And that's precisely the second issue. It takes a long time to get through this place, which is even worse if you're trying to get all the items. Trust me, if you're doing that, you want an online map. Remember when I said that the Labyrinth of Memories wasn't so bad? Yeah, this is one of the reasons I said that. This place is sprawling. If you're just trying to get through to the end, then it isn't nearly as much of a chore. You know those little warp rooms in Super Mario Bros.? They've got little exits in here that are kind of like that. If you take one, you'll jump multiple floors on the same layer. Now, again, I like that idea in theory, but in practice, it's just a big middle finger to anyone trying to get everything done. The warp rooms are often deliberately placed on floors to make it inconvenient to have to go around them and explore more, and the act of exiting through one often places you just past the floor with a one-of-a-kind item or a save point, both of which are very important for completion. For instance, the first two layers have Flynn and Patty's fell arms on them. As you progress through the floors here, you'll inevitably reach ones that have multiple exits, with varying distances to the entrance. The obvious choice here is to just go to the closer exit and get out faster. But if you thought that, then you have just fallen into the developer's trap. These exits will warp you near the end of the layer, but on the floor right after the fell arms, meaning that you now have to take one of those warp pads in the center room all the way back up to the top and then go through every single floor again from start to finish. Ugh. And don't get me started on the fact that you can't actually tell what exits lead where, or if there are even good items to begin with. See this floor? If you took the warp earlier, you would have passed it. There are two rooms at the top that the map has designated as rooms with items, but the exit is right there next to you. Clearly this is a trick. There's gotta be good items up there. Except that there's not. These item rooms are worthless. They contain basic consumables that you probably don't need, or rather, weren't important enough to go out of your way to get. If you don't have a guide or a player-made map telling you all of this, then you'll probably come to one of two logical conclusions while exploring this place. 1. You enter a bunch of item rooms only to find that they always have gels, consider them a waste of time, and skip them all. Or 2. You accidentally stumble upon one of the item rooms that has a special item in it. Realizing there's no discerning the difference between important and non-important rooms, you decide to check every single one in the entire dungeon. Can you tell I'm going insane just talking about this? When I first played this game on the PS3, I didn't actually have a map or the internet to tell me any of this. so I found myself eventually coming to both earlier conclusions one after the other. The regular enemies here also happen to be the strongest in the game, reaching levels almost as high as 200 on the final floor, so it can really drag out the length of the fights as you try to progress. Not to mention the variety of resistances they have. Without the EXP bonuses from New Game Plus, I was about level 120 by the end of it all, meaning it would take an eternity to reach 200 at that pace. I suppose that's about as good of a transition as I'm going to get for New Game Plus, so let's talk about that quick before I wrap things up. Throughout the game, you've been receiving grade points based on your performance in battles. You could trade them at Namkobanda Island for casino chips, but if you thought that was the only use for them, then I'm very sorry to have to tell you this. The main use for grade is New Game Plus. When you start New Game Plus with your cleared save file, your total grade throughout the game is allotted to you to spend on various perks and bonuses. There are a lot of things that you can get, with arguably the most important being the various carryover bonuses, which let you keep your weapons, skills, costumes, and more in your next run. After you bring what you want with you, you can help or hinder yourself with XP modifiers, HP and TP modifiers, double galled, and so on. You get the point. This helps immensely in getting the game completed, because there's just so much missable content. Definitely, if you're playing for the first time, then I recommend that you don't actually try and get everything on your first run. You certainly can try, but I don't think you should because it will likely bring down your enjoyment of the game. And if you need more grade, then you can just...
Blah blah blah.
You can just use the tried and true Rita technique for farming fatal strike chains. It's probably on a New Game Plus run that you'll grab a guide and finally have the chance to do some of the side content you missed, like the movie tie-in with the sword dancer, or get some achievements, like scanning every enemy and completing all the secret missions. The maximum level in the game is 200, which, as I said before, isn't really feasible without 10 times XP on. Sure, you can go for it if you want, but I think that's kinda crazy. With enough power under your belt, you can take on the Spiral Draco at the bottom of the Necropolis dungeon. If you recall, this is the entity mentioned by Duke when he gained his final form from the Fell Arms. What an alliteration. Of course, that statement made no sense back in 2008, but now we can see just what the King of the Entelekea is all about. If ever there was a super boss, this is it. At level 200 and with 6 distinct body parts, this whole fight is absurd. Your Fell Arms don't work, your Fatal Strikes don't work, and each head has its own immunities and resistances. Honestly, even when I was fighting it, I could hardly tell what the hell was going on. So I'll just let the footage do the talking.
That's so good. Creatures come to be. Blah blah blah.
Faye! Take this and to get Fatal Gale!
Meow. Gold cats.
Shining Faye!
That's so good. Meteor storm.
Faye! Take this and again!
Oh, brilliant angels, grant us your... Regenerate! Blah, blah, blah. Tidal apoplectic raging drive!
Ghost Wolf! Rending Wolf Charge!
I who stand in the full light of the heaven, call upon thee who openeth the gates of hell. Come forth, divine lightning! This ends now! Indignation!
Oh, countless armies that wander the heavens, rain down and glorify the land. Meteor storm! Come, oh silver
You're
light!
dead! Divine Wolf! You're gone!
Come, O power!
Shine, light of the morning star! Try some of this! Heavenly Blade Wing!
Oh, angelic princess, grant us your magnificent...
There's no way we're gonna lose.
If you manage to defeat it, the party makes one final note that they should probably continue on to Tarkaron for their real final battle to save the world, which can only be seen as a joke at this point. And with that, we've covered just about all of the important stuff in the game. As I said much earlier, part of me considers Vesperia to be my favorite game of all time. I really, really do love this game. But after this playthrough, I think that Vesperia has been solidified to me as a flawed masterpiece. The game still has the ability to draw out my emotion like few others, and I still find myself laughing and crying to many events that I've already experienced before. That alone is enough to rank it among my top contenders. But I'd be lying if I said that reaching these points was frustration-free. I think that the port of the game added a lot of content, most of which I like, but I don't think parts of it were as well thought out as they could have been. Patty and the Necropolis are the standouts here as wasted potential in my eyes, but I think that's a fairly bold and subjective statement. The original still holds the title for the most consistent product in my eyes, even if it's the last version I'd play now. Towns and dungeons having so little to do in them has only started to bother me with this most recent run. Possibly because I know them so well, but I think it's more likely that the core design is starting to show its age. Though now that I think about it, the Sewers of Promise that I was calling the Oath Waterway earlier, another translation thing, had a nice gimmick going on, so I think that the designers realized pretty quickly that something more needed to be done. The combat is still okay in my opinion. It's mostly helped by other mechanics in the game propping it up, like the skills system, and the fact that new weapons actually feel good to obtain. I specifically recall my biggest grievances with newer titles like Vesperia and Vesperia being that weapons weren't as unique as I wanted them to be, and instead dropped artificially or with random modifiers that made them feel less personable. I'll always remember how I got the, Clive Solish? I'll always remember how I got that sword in that side quest I mentioned earlier. It has history, it has a unique name, it's one of a kind. It's cool. A lot of the weapons in Vesperia have personality. They have flair. I much prefer that over the random nature in the newer games. You can't really get ahead of the curve with this system since most weapons are gated by progress, but I always feel like I have something to work on. I dislike that there isn't as much to react to though, like the FOF circles in Abyss, making most bosses feel really similar to fight, and forcing the game to rely on cheap mechanics. Again, subjective, but I think that it says something when one of the first bosses of the game is almost legendary for how overpowered it is, because the basic mechanics aren't enough to deal with it properly, unless you know them extremely well or abuse them. Or grind, I guess. Or Alexei, for example, who can and will trigger his mystic art over and over without the restraints you're normally under, and hit everyone on screen with potential for KO from full health. There is no coming into this fight too underleveled trying to skill your way through. If you have too little HP or defense, he'll just kill you with his mystic. You can't block it, and you can't dodge it. The only real option is to just stun lock him forever and kill him faster. Outside of just buffing yourself, there's not really any counterplay, and it's been too long since I've played a more recent Tales game, so I can't really say if that's been addressed. I still have a lot of fun with the combat either way, but I recognize that it's not something everyone will enjoy. Even with so much experience under my belt, I still have trouble lining myself up properly for attacks sometimes, or jumping on accident, which is annoying as hell. But I love hearing Rita's incantations and trying to manage all of the intricate combos I can perform in my head. Just before this playthrough, I had been talking about how nice isometric camera angles can be, because they let the artist paint a specific picture without compromise. I find myself sort of regretting that statement. Capua Torum looks really cool and all, but imagine being able to turn the camera and see Capua Nor, or the other side of a building even. I think newer Tales games were right to abandon the isometric approach. They certainly have their place in some games, but I don't think the Tales series is it. Of course, I think that newer games also haven't really done everything they can with the camera, so dungeons in a game like Vesperia are less interesting to look at than dungeons in Vesperia. These names confusing you yet? In addition, I think that a lot of the translation and voice acting done with the DE really brought my enjoyment of the game down a lot, and I think it's disrespectful and lazy of Namco Bandai to have released it like this, just as much as I think it would be disrespectful of me as a fan to be okay with it just because I get to play it in English. Considering I already have the game with a translation patch on the PS3, I don't consider this newest release to be any more definitive than that one, or even less so depending on how much value I give the translations themselves.
You've learned a bit!
Slog assault!
Seriously? Slog assault? Are you fucking kidding me? Either way, a few Troy Baker lines is far from enough to make me stay with English audio, and that includes the knowledge that I won't understand conversations in battles anymore. It's just that bad. On a more positive note, I feel like every time I play through the game again, I notice little intricacies I hadn't before. I had at one point believed that Yuri's vigilante subplot was completely dropped during Act 3, but it was during this playthrough that I realized it was subtly inverted to have Yuri see things from a different point of view, which was, of course, kinda cool. Maybe I'm a total idiot for having just realized that now, but I had always considered Yuri a hypocrite when he argued with people doing the same things as him. Even thinking they changed the narrative focus of the game from morality and justice to don't misuse technology was a bit off, because in the end, the greater message of the game is to find compromise with people you disagree with. I mean, seriously, I think I was just blinded by what was in front of me, when there was way more subtext to the game than I had initially considered. I expect that the next time I play, I'll notice even more things, and maybe I'll even like Patty then. It's also cool how so many side quests tie in with the themes present throughout the entire game, and that even more of them have a substantial payoff. Even events without any reward at all can be entertaining, like the ones featuring Duke, or taking your revenge against the Fountain Core thief. There's seriously just so much content in the game that I think it would be understandable if most people don't ever see it. If you've actually managed to sit through this entire video and you haven't actually played the game, then I really do recommend that you give it a try. Don't try to play on a higher difficulty, because the less frustration you have to endure, the better. You can always change the difficulty on the fly to suit your needs. No harm, no foul. Just try to absorb what you can from the story and see any side content that comes your way. If you like the game enough, then you can go through it again on New Game Plus with a guide and try your hand at some of the harder challenges. Hopefully everything I spoiled won't actually ruin the experience for you and will instead help you in coming to your own understanding and perspective of events. Sincerely, thank you for watching. This project took me a very long time to complete, and I'm still not completely satisfied with how it turned out. The entire process was a learning experience, and I definitely made some mistakes along the way. I also experimented with a lot of things while editing, so please be sure to leave your comments and complaints below to help me improve the next video. I didn't talk about everything I wanted to, but again, there's just too much content in this game, so it was very difficult to decide what was actually worthwhile. 2 hours was already pushing it pretty far with my limited skill set, so it was all done to produce a more concise video. Most of what I skipped was either because it was too minor or because it was already addressed in a more recent Tales game that I can recall. Maybe someday I can return to Vesperia again and expand my thoughts, but that's a ways away, if ever. Thank you Namco Bandai for bringing Vesperia PS3 over to the West so that people who didn't want to import it can play it. I'm re-recording this outro bit after having just seen the patch notes that finally fix an issue where Flynn and Patty would speak in Japanese even when set to English. An issue that took 2 months to solve since release. Not a big deal, but I thought it was funny and lended well to my idea of Bamco having little in the way of interest for the integrity of Vesperia. The fixed spelling of Orga-Ax +1 was a nice touch though, so at least something was improved. Again, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.